Okay, people, transport in the time of COVID update 2nd of November. Yeah, disregard that link there. I'll have to take that off. Yes, send me stuff on Chair RDRF or go to our website to pick up previous issues on YouTube and slides and whatnot. Okay, so this week was really about two things, the budget and about COP26. So let's kick off with the budget. After 12 consecutive years of frozen fuel duty rates, the average car driver will have saved a total of £1,900. So, the fuel duty accelerator was cancelled yet again. The total amount that has saved motorists and cost everybody else is over £110 billion. So that's pretty dreadful. Also pretty dreadful from the budget and comprehensive spending review, which we're in together, was the continuation of the road building program was 27 billion. Some of that has been specified as being for relatively green things, but it's still basically a road building program. So with that budget, and the comprehensive spending review and COP26, we're looking like it's emphasis on electric vehicles and very little, if indeed anything at all, on active travel. So not good. I'll go into it a bit more detail. Take a look at this by Carbon Brief on how the fuel duty freeze has increased UK CO2 emissions by up to 5%. And a very good article, because of course also there was the cut in some costs of flying. Read that by Leo Murray. That's a very good article. We Are Cycling UK have said the ring-fence funding of £2 billion over 5 years will enable councils to carry on, but it won't deliver the amount that's needed, which should be about 4 times as much. So Cycling UK saying, that £2 billion allocated specifically to cycling should have increased. So that's a few bits of bad news there, really. Here is a very, very good article by Roger Geffen. The government still isn't on course to meet its 2025 targets for cycling in urban areas. So what now? Do read that article by Roger Geffen. We're going to try and get him along to speak maybe next week or the week after. Some points from his article. He's been through the net zero strategy with a fine tooth comb, and on page 326, government estimates current level of walking and cycling in urban areas is 42%. They've specified in gear change and other documents they want to have 50% by 2030. So they have apparently the plan, they've got milestones of 46% by 2025, the 50% by 2030 and 55% by 2035. And he goes into where we might be getting money from and how it may work out, what it all means in that article. And that's all against the background of the fuel duty accelerated cancelled again, is giving a few £1 billion to motorists every year on top of what was given previously, plus there's been no cutting back on the road building program RIS2. Anyway, Cycling UK are trying to have a presence at COP26, a lot of graphics up there. There are rides on the 6th of November, that's this coming Saturday, throughout the UK And if you go to that link, you should be able to find out where one is on near to you. So do look at that. Here's a letter from the President of the European Cyclists Federation in Financial Times saying that what's got to happen is you've got to promote cycling. Cycling and walking have got to be promoted as well as EVs to meet any kinds of greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. Okay, now I did mention this last week, the net zero strategy and how little there was on cycling and walking. That's just that paragraph saying it's cycling and walking are good. And the reiteration of £2 billion over 5 years, and the target of half of all journeys in towns and cities to be cycle or walk by 2030. But as Carlton Reid has pointed out, and he's referring to this article in Carbon Brief, we haven't got the support for walking and cycling, in particular at COP26. Carlton last week mentioned the meeting the Prime Minister had with members of the UK's automotive interests. And this week, Peter Walker has noted that sponsors of COP26 include Jaguar and Land Rover. So a lot of vested interests who aren't going to be pushing cycling and walking. There is the COP26 Cycling Forum. If you go on the Cycling UK website, you'll see Duncan Dollymore speaking at that. Again, Carlton's been saying, who's up at the main conference centre, has said, yeah, there are a few bits and pieces, but it's 2 miles away from the conference centre and it could be a world away for all the impact on the main issues to do with transport. There's the graphic I put up last week from Cycling UK. There are some graphics coming out today from the BBC indicating that just shifting to an electric vehicle will save enormous amounts of carbon. That's not true. Read my article on the RDRF website on why EVs are something of a red herring. You should have seen the link a number of times. I can give it to you again if you want it. And I put this in again last week, that this is from that target is from the government's official body, the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, saying there needs to be a 4% cut in kilometres driven per driver by 2035 from 2019, which means that you have to have those quite dramatic shifts to walking and cycling in urban areas, because that's the low-hanging fruit of getting people out of cars. So, you know, emphasize that again, that is from the official body, so do be aware of that. And we talked about that last week when we had Lisa from Transport for Quality of Life. Okay, away from COP26 for a bit. I have mentioned this before, but just mentioning it again, because if you go to that, this is the first time that the Who Kills Whom issue, which came out in the Pacts report, which I contributed to. It's the first time it's taken notice of what I've been saying for the past 35 years. You've got to look not just at the issues in terms of people who have been hurt or killed, but those other parties, those third parties involved in hurting or killing them. That's there under those 2 footnotes. So do have a look again. That's my lifetime contribution. Something has been finally accepted by me, by central government. Thank you. Okay, your victim blaming for this week. This is from IAM Road Smart, the Institute of Advanced Motorists, which was set up by a racing driver before the Second World War. Some people have got the IAM qualifications and they think it is something which can help. I'm a bit dubious. Anyway, one of their spokespeople, Richard Gladman, their head of driving and riding standards, said, in a perfect world, it would be ideal if pedestrians would all stay on the pavement and would never need to cross the road. It would also be ideal if all pedestrians wore flashing high vis. So, we do get this when the clocks go back. It's, I mean, I understand that people will say that cyclists have to have lights on at night, but frankly, this is sheer victim blaming in my view. So there's something else from our friends in Northants Police. Samuel Shoesmith, who's attended here sometimes, said how he submitted some footage through Operation Snap, that's the National Third Party Reporting Service, and how there should have been lots of results. But the police sent back a form saying, if you're a cyclist, were you wearing reflective clothing? Now, there was lack of attention, honking a horn, blocking the cycle lane, close pass. What's that got to do with whether he's wearing high vis or not? So not good from Northants Police. Okay, again, I mentioned the police crime sentencing and courts bill and what that's being pulled together by Cycling UK. And here are the various things they're going for. Do get in touch with me if you want to learn a bit more about that. And yes, the equalities page. This is a painting of a woman cyclist in 1890 by Alfred Schoubrac. I think was based in Paris. And here is what happens when a woman rides a bicycle. Look, it's absolute mayhem, absolute death and disaster. People are knocked over, dogs are killed, everybody's freaked out, and it's all because of a woman cycling. So that was the response to women cycling in 1890. Okay, well, back on the reading list, consultations you have to do and so on. These were up last week. Now, there are some important things you should get to read and look at. Here's a piece featuring Lucy Marstrand of the Road Danger Reduction Forum Committee, who's spoken here before. She was in a lovely piece on ITV News showing how transport could be transformed to cut toxic fumes, was coinciding with the ULEZ being introduced in London. But it's a nice little piece if it's still up, and very nice with Lucy on a hire bike wearing normal clothes, talking to the reporter there. That was nice. Yeah, it's an event called Motherload. That's about cargo bikes and carrying kids. That's on next Wednesday. Something by Jeanette Sadi Khan, The Bike Lash Paradox. And she's saying that you do get negative reaction, but after a while that closes down, and in fact you can win votes by making a more livable environment. So you should have a look at that. And this is something that you do need to listen to by Will Self. He has a point of view on Radio 4. It's a 10-minute bit, and do listen to that. He's pretty good on walking and cycling. Do listen to it, and you'll find you are not alone in your views. George Monbiot on, he opposes something which he's christened micro-consumerist bollocks. Or bullshit, I forget, MCB, that's the new acronym for you. Do have a read of that. And PACTS have come out with a report on the safety of private e-scooters, which I will let you look at. The main thing is that they emphasize that there's a big difference between the normal use of e-scooters which are being bought and the ones that are being used in the trial rental schemes. More reading here. You've seen all these before. Yeah, news thing is the government launches a consultation on road collision investigation branch. We've been trying to get that for a while, but just watch out. This is what Mark Hodson says. This is welcome, but it won't solve the immediate issues we face. Those of us who work in the field know why collisions occur, so that isn't the issue. The issue is driver behaviour and changing those endangering behaviours. To this, we need enforcement resources. But I think we will all be welcoming that through our various organisations. So if you are in one, do take a look at it. Okay, news from around the UK. Now, Edinburgh, they tweeted we're in the process of removing walking and cycling measures introduced during lockdown. So I was thinking, oh, is this bad news again? So I asked Edinburgh people, and the Edinburgh City Councillors will be retaining many of the schemes, and there's the link for you to make your own mind up. Angus Calder responded by saying it was unfortunate timing, but definitely not all bad. Most pedestrian-focused local centre schemes will be removed, but on the other hand, a majority of temporary segregation and city centre schemes will be retained via ETRO. Anyway, I don't know if anybody from Edinburgh wants to say any more about that, but do let us know if you want to. Okay, this is from Falkirk, the Futuristic aerial roundabout, which has got £20 million funding. And, you know, some people might say, oh, look, you know, there's special facilities for people to walk and cycle. But on the other hand, if you didn't have this enormous roundabout there in the first place, you wouldn't need it. So is this actually a step forward, or is it a bit of greenwashing to something which is to increase capacity for motor vehicular traffic? I don't know, but it doesn't look that wonderful actually after you've considered that roundabout underneath. Brighton and Hove. Now, you know about the story about Old Shoreham Road. Some people have gone out and painted this line in. So Jeremy and Sarah Horn made a video, and in the video, Jeremy can be heard saying, somebody, some vandal, some disgraceful human being to society has painted a white line on the road. Oh, shock and horror. You can read the whole story there. Harrogate, this is yet again a first Dutch style roundabout, but it isn't. Is it actually a Dutch style roundabout or not? The various engineers on Twitter have said no, it isn't, but that's up to you to decide. Okay, in London, yeah, that's the piece with Lucy Marstrand. Do have a look at that. And Kidical Mass is on Sunday, the 7th of November. So that's related to COP26. The cycle trainers protest the cuts their work. I have mentioned about the cuts in cycle training by TfL, and a lot of them have got organised, and there they met in Trafalgar Square and went to City Hall, welcomed by Caroline Russell of one of the three Green Party members of the London Assembly. Havering, right, yes, there was a thread from the leader of Havering Council, Councillor White, and Simon Monk has made some points saying that what Councillor White says was done wasn't done, or was done years ago. If Havering wants funding credibility, then do better on finding cheap ways or to fob off future generations, and he'd be happy to help advise Councillor White and ride around Waltham Forest and show him what can be done. Now, this is something I spotted today in Brent. This is, I go down the Carlton Vale separated cycle track, and you might think there's nothing remarkable about that. But what's remarkable is that a few days before I went down it, and it was absolutely completely full of leaves. And so credit due to Brent Council, who have actually got down there and cleaned it up. So it's nice and usable.
Bob, can I just stop you a sec? Have you got much more to go through?
Not much more coming through.
Yeah, another couple of minutes, and then I think.
Okay, that's
Brilliant.
Cycling UK from there. And here's Steve's friend, Peter Hitchens, a tweet a few years ago. Apparently, he's been very good about bicycle crash helmets. He was advised to wear one, and he was saying cycling is part of normal life, just like walking. So he doesn't want to get dressed for battle. Good for Peter Hitchens. Credit where it's due. And here's a nice visual from Patagonia. Starting off horrible and getting worse, but you read it bottom up. I'll leave that to you to look at your leisure afterwards. Oh yeah, one more thing. Mini planters are for sale, and they go to a charity which rescues kittens or something. So what's not to like there? A nice mini planter. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. That was great, Bob. That's a really comprehensive update. I'm not going to take any kind of questions or points of order. If you have any burning things you need to say, you can say them in the chat, and we can maybe, if there's time at the end, address those. Because I want to leave enough time after Amy for Claire Stocks to update us all on, or give us a sort of a summary of the conversation on school streets that took place a few weeks ago. I just wanted to say a really quick thing, it's Chair's prerogative, that just the Cycling UK at COP26 campaign is being run in partnership with Pedal on Parliament, and they've got a really great little video, so I would check that out if you haven't had a look at it already. So next we've got Amy Priestley, and she is going to talk to us about the rejuvenation of local high streets. So Amy, are you able to, have you got a presentation that you want to share?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Sally. I will try and share that now.
Brilliant.
I can see that. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Hi everyone, my name's Amy. I'm sort of first after uni, sort of joined Waltham Forest Council. Not really as anything other than a sort of project officer, who kind of forged myself a bit of an urban design role, as my degree was in urban design, and sort of helped develop some of the proposals around the mini Holland scheme. I feel like everyone here is very well informed of walking and cycling around the UK generally, so I'm assuming that a lot of people have probably heard of the scheme at least, but I just want to sort of give you all a run through of sort of some of my thoughts on how that project went, and how we did it, and then some sort of more kind of relevant thoughts to sort of what's happening at the moment and what's happening today. So thank you all for having me. So first I just thought sort of, well, why local high streets? You know, I think there's a real sort of distinction at the moment, I think, between sort of town centres and city centres and local high streets, and they seem to be having such a revival, I think, at the moment. And you know, it really sort of begs the question of what are our local high streets for? And I think with sort of COVID-19 and the new normal, and sort of working from home and staying local, and sort of this whole idea of sort of outdoor hospitality, we know that there's been quite a strong trend for people relying much more on the facilities that are available on their doorstep. I think it's also very topical in the sense that sort of 15-minute neighbourhoods, 10-minute neighbourhoods, 5-minute neighbourhoods even, and actually ensuring that these places actually play a much bigger role in the future of local neighbourhoods and local places. And I really hope that that can kind of leak into some of the sort of newer developments that are coming forward, and the idea of what a local centre is, because it's doesn't really appeal to me, that term, but actually what some of these sort of brand new local centres might become, and how they might be able to mimic some of the sort of more traditional local high streets that already exist. And I think another sort of really sort of interesting trend that sort of has been happening over the past few years is the sort of the diversification of the offer and what people need. I think with the decline of the high streets just generally, but also kind of the increase in the sort of hospitality sector is something that certainly was a factor in Francis Road. But also there are lots of other uses coming forward, things to do with freight and kind of consolidated sort of deliveries and Hermes parcel shops and kind of cargo bikes and deliveries. There's sort of a much sort of more diverse range of things that local high streets can do and could do and are doing in lots of cases. I just sort of want to point to this article, which possibly came up in one of your earlier sessions, but I thought it was really interesting, the future of London's retailers and its local centres, and just some statistics around sort of just what the impact has been on local high streets in London specifically. But I think this article did go on to say that actually there's further research around the UK might well indicate a very similar picture in some other corners of the country as well. And actually, some of the things that we've seen, this is where I used to live in London, in Wandsworth, Old York Road, and actually how this has become, from what was already, a fairly good local high street, has become an even better street that's become much more dominated by kind of public life and pedestrians, and activity really that is much more sort of conducive to active travel. Living healthy lifestyles, and also maximising what this high street is doing for local people as well. So it's a great time for local high streets. So hopefully it's quite a topical subject to cover at the moment. And just another really interesting sort of observation. This is from my hometown up in Morley, on the outskirts of Leeds, and this is a junction that I'd pondered over so many times, thinking, it wouldn't be great if we could just close an arm of this junction that basically is the bookend to the high street and the town centre. And you can see this is one of those four arms that essentially is one of the main traffic routes into town. And you think, well, it'd be great to do something here with one of those arms. And amazingly, things have happened, and this is a visual for what the council were planning. And then these are just some images from Twitter. I haven't had the pleasure of going back home yet to see it in action, but it looks pretty well used so far. So there's some really interesting things happening in places that I wouldn't necessarily, I think would have much more of a battle to get things like this in. So I just thought it would be good to mention that as well. So on to Francis Road and the sort of Enjoy Waltham Forest scheme, also originally known as the Mini Holland scheme. This was Waltham Forest was selected as one of 3 London boroughs to be awarded £30 million worth of funding from TfL, which was then topped up to around 50 million by the borough itself. And this basically it kickstarted a network of low traffic neighbourhoods. At the time that term wasn't really, I don't know if it wasn't really widely used. We were calling them villages. But now that seems to become low traffic neighbourhoods, seems to encapsulate sort of how they work a bit better. But really this kickstarted a sort of a programme of low traffic neighbourhoods within existing residential areas, as well as a series of segregated cycle routes, and that really has expanded. This map, when I first joined the council, was sort of confined to kind of this area down here, and since then there are more lines appearing, there are more kind of villages appearing, which is all great to see. We should have said I no longer work for the council. I sort of left there about 3 years ago, so it's great to see that there lots of things are still carrying on. Since I've left as well, there's a sort of real sort of momentum to keep this stuff going. So on to Francis Road. This is essentially what it was like when I first saw Francis Road. local high street in a sense that it's not a kind of an arterial route necessarily. It's not got a bus on it, no bus route, sorry, on it. It is a two-way traffic road, and there's kind of two sections of really what is a sort of historic sort of parade of shops really that runs through a residential area. It is actually a B road, interestingly, and it did carry around 5,000 vehicles a day, according to our sort of original traffic surveys. Parked up both sides, as you can see there, and I think there was some sort of wheel-up parking as well in some places along the route as well. There had been a little bit of tree planting. You can't see from this photo, but on the sort of the second section of the road, there were a few sort of new trees that had been planted, but really this was an area that was suffering quite badly from sort of neglect. It was no longer really providing people with sort of the facilities that they needed. There were all the signs, there were sort of 6 hairdressers out of about 20 shops, things like that. There were lots of vacant units, lots of kind of units that were sort of just a bit run down, very little on the street activity, not really any chairs and tables outside. And actually, people didn't really see this as the centre of their neighbourhood, didn't really have a strong identity, a strong sort of use really. So in a way, this was sort of taking what was there and trying to really kind of not completely reinvent it, but trying to really kind of boost what was there and kickstart some sort of improvements really. Some of the key factors on this particular scheme, obviously trying to sort of achieve those sustainable travel aims, which were a really key part of the Mini Holland scheme. That was sort of aiming to make cycling accessible for everyone aged between the age of 8 and 80. Limiting through traffic, which again was a key kind of element of the Mini Holland scheme, was to introduce modal filters in residential areas, and this was one of them, to really reduce the amount of through traffic on those streets and kick it back to the sort of main, more strategic borough and London-wide routes for traffic. The needs of businesses obviously is a really key factor, and I'll come on to that a bit later. The economic context, there was I think Mini Holland came at a good time for Waltham Forest. There's a lot of movement in terms of sort of house price growth and people moving from Hackney and other parts of London into the borough. It was kind of the next sort of cool place to live, if you like. There were some units on Francis Road that had recently sort of opened and where there were kind of new ideas being tested, but they really lacked that kind of sort of critical mass of things to see and do there that's so important in supporting those businesses. Parking and loading was a really key issue as well. Obviously, you could see from the photos before, the street was double parked, both sides of the road were parked along, but actually a lot of that parking wasn't really doing much for the businesses. A lot of it, unfortunately, was business owners and people like that sort of parking up for the day and not moving their car. So it wasn't really doing much in terms of providing customers with places to park. The needs of the local residents, obviously, a very important one, and something that I think the Mini Holland project. So we did try and test different methods of sort of engaging with people, and it's something that I think our work on with using the Commonplace app for sort of local community engagement really worked. Public realm obviously is a really key one for a local high street, and we know that people want to find places attractive and enjoyable in order to be able to use them, and obviously air quality, and also sort of thinking about vulnerable users as well. So I just wanted to kind of talk through some of the sort of key strategies really for essentially what we did was just to close the road to traffic between for the vast majority of the day, basically. And actually that's, it's quite a controversial thing when there are 5,000 vehicles a day going along it, when we've had kind of problems and challenges from the local community on other schemes, and the Francis Road scheme came off the back of the Alford Road scheme, which is very similar, and that was met with kind of protests. So it was quite a interesting sort of context in which to work. And we didn't kind of employ all of these methods, but I think this is sort of what I would do if I was kind of starting from scratch with something like this. And I think the first thing was really to say hello. I think it's when people find a consultation leaflet with a visualization on land on their doorstep, I think that's I think people almost feel a bit threatened by that, and they feel like they've not been involved in any way in their local areas, and actually that something's been imposed on them. And I think something that the Mini Holland project did really well was to sort of identify basically on the Francis Road project, we went in and spoke to all the businesses directly. We said hello. We said we're thinking about a scheme on the streets, and basically introduced ourselves. And I think it was a real kind of a sort of soft start, I think, to the engagement that followed. I think identifying champions is a really, really key one. And the Waltham Forest cycling campaign were absolutely invaluable to the whole process, and they were a real sort of friend to the whole project. And Francis Road was no different. And I think having those sort of local interest groups on board, or they might not even be interest groups, they might be kind of just keen local residents or keen politicians even, or kind of schools and people like that, or businesses that might just help to champion the scheme. And we did have a few of the businesses, I think from memory there are two in particular that were really vocal about wanting change on Francis Road. Secondly, it was to sort of gather data and engage. And I think, there's all the kind of the classic sort of traffic count data, parking and loading surveys, but also kind of talking to businesses directly about what their operational needs are, how many deliveries do they get, what vehicles do they use, all those kinds of things, that even if you can't accommodate them all, exactly how they would like, at least we can gather that data and ensure that the street can work for who is there already. Visitor and local resident surveys, I think, are really important as well. And that was something that the Mini Holland project did quite well, in that we did lots of surveys prior to the designing the Francis Road scheme about the wider area, just to kind of get people's views on what the problems are, what they liked, what they disliked, that could then provide a bit of a platform and help to build a bit of a narrative to continue those discussions and to propose some fairly radical measures, such as closing off streets and introducing modal filters. And I think, there's kind of gathering data and there's engagement, and I think all of this kind of comes together to ultimately build the narrative. I think there's as much value in viewing surveys and local views as data, and also thinking about how you gather data and how that might be able to kind of dispel some of the myths that will probably come out. We know that, for example, we know that businesses don't necessarily they don't think that their customers travel in the ways that they do actually travel. So that's a really key thing as well. So this was the kind of the wider sort of Leighton town centre, the sort of Leighton village scheme. You can see Francis Road just there in pink. So essentially we engaged with the residents around this whole area, just asking them what their problems were, what they'd like to see. And from there, that provided us with a bit of a baseline to start and go and talk to some of the businesses on Francis Road itself. So that area-wide engagement was essentially a posted leaflet to 11,000 households, and overall the results were positive. Most people were supportive of schemes. At this point, we had proposed things like modal filters, and that was gave us a really good sort of springboard for the sort of future development of Francis Road. And just coming back to this point of how this kind of can help to have that kind of conversation with people. I think one of the really good things that the project did was to play back to people what they told us, and actually to compare and contrast different answers, so that we can really kind of play that back to businesses and say, actually, people wanted to, local residents and local visitors wanted to see more tree planting, whereas businesses just wanted to see more car parking, for example. I think that really helped with some of the discussions that we had. For example, this was a survey we did on Leabridge Road, and it was sort of specifically designed to help us dispel some of the myths that we knew were going to come out about, you know, people drive to my off license or my hairdressers or whatever it is, and actually dispelling some of those myths. So here you can see most people, most visitors to Leabridge Road wanted better crossing, less traffic, cycle lanes, but actually businesses wanted better car parking and better located parking and things like that. So it kind of helps to kind of broach the subject and have some evidence backing you up as well. The Healthy Streets indicators, one, we hadn't had, I mean, this came in more with sort of Sadiq Khan and the Mini Holland project started under Boris Johnson. So we didn't really have the Healthy Streets indicators as we know them at the moment. They weren't a big, or they existed, but they weren't as big a thing as they are now. So this is another, you know, really great way, I think, that, you know, to start that conversation is to just do a quick Healthy Streets check. Because you can then play that back to people. And I think, you know, it's really great how some of the indicators are worded in a really kind of accessible way. You know, people feel safe. You know, that's really easy for anyone to understand what these are trying to do. I think that's another great way that we didn't use this on Francis Road, but something that for future projects is really handy to have. And then obviously there's evidence from other places, you know, the pedestrian pound, the TfL sort of walking and cycling spending data as well. So there's some really sort of great data out there that can help to kind of reassure businesses, because that's ultimately all that they were concerned about was, am I going to go bust because you're closing the road? And it's hard to kind of say no, you're not, because ultimately none of us really know, you know, what's going to happen. And businesses on Francis Road have changed. You know, there are much less vacant units as a result of what we did, but there has been some change as well. So it's hard to kind of fully reassure anyone that they will still be around, but in the same way that you couldn't reassure them even if nothing happened. But I think all we can do is act on the evidence that is already around, such as these projects, these reports, for example. And I think also one of the really great things we had was a sort of precedent of Alford Road, which is in this picture here, which was much more controversial than Francis Road. I think partly because it was the first scheme that we'd done. Also because we were testing out how to get schemes through and what the best ways were to bring people along with that process were. And that was a very controversial scheme that when the grand opening happened, there were protests on the streets. But, you know, since then, the council had done sort of post-occupancy research that had found that, you know, all the units were now occupied on Alford Road for the first time in, I think, about 20 years, something like that. There was also sort of a resident survey and business survey asking people what they thought, and lots of people thought that the improvements to Alford Road were the best thing about the whole village scheme in that particular project. And I think only 1.7% of people said that they would, if when asked how it could be improved, said they wanted it ripped out. So that's a really great sort of springboard again for having that discussion on Francis Road. And I think just having more of these examples around the country is a really helpful thing to have in the sort of toolkit. So around 25 businesses on Francis Road, plus a fair few vacant units as well. But we essentially went out to them and asked exactly what they would like to see on the street, to the point that I think the survey was worded, what would you like outside your shop? A planter, a parking space, a loading bay, or a tree. We went to sort of that level of detail with all of the businesses. And I think they really appreciated that sort of approach to it. It also meant that we went out and saw them fairly frequently. We got to know them. And we kind of got to identify some of those champions that could help to have discussions with their neighbours. And although we weren't involved in that per se, which I think is a good thing, I think the businesses did have their own discussions with each other as the scheme was progressing from our end. So that was a really positive sort of thing as well, that I think helped to sort of dissipate any kind of anger. And then sort of the next step was sort of onto the design really. This is a sort of zoomed in section of that half of the Leighton Town Centre scheme. So as you can see, the yellow sections are new one-ways. So this is all about traffic management, all about reducing the amount of vehicles coming along Francis Road, and really giving that space back to pedestrians and cyclists, and also just encouraging active travel generally. So you can see that in order to do that, we introduced a series of modal filters. So for example, down here, and also the yellow streets with the arrows indicate where new one-way restrictions were introduced, and the orange sections are the time closures, which was, I think it was 10 till 8, I think. And this is some of those other sort of complementary measures. This is on Richmond Road in just around the corner from Francis Road. This is a scheme simply to narrow down an existing junction mouth, and create a sort of local pocket park for local residents, which has been really successful. This was taken last summer. And this was the sort of final design for the Francis Road scheme. So as you can see, it's a 10 to 8 road closure, 7 days a week. And you can see that here we've got the opposing one way, so one way southbound, one way northbound, basically cutting off. Even when the road is open to traffic outside of the closure hours, there still isn't a through route effectively. It's still a longer way around for vehicles to go. And that was a really sort of key part of ensuring the success of the scheme. We don't really want vehicles to try and get through it, at sort of 1 minute to 10 or things like that. We want them to know that they shouldn't use this area for travelling through, and therefore even outside the closure hours it shouldn't be a busy kind of through route. And that plan was then, we sort of fed back to people and informed them, and that was probably the most controversial it got. I remember being on a sort of burger van type facility on Francis Road with that plan, having an argument until I was blue in the face with the same person, with just one person for about 2 hours. And that was it, basically. There were no coffins, there were no protests. It was just one person arguing for a few hours, and that was all the pain that we really had. And finally, it was to build the scheme. So this was some of the after photos. This is of the sort of northern section of the scheme. So we kept in the existing trees that were planted, introduced more in-street planting beds that some of the businesses have planted up and looked after. So some of the businesses, for example, there's a bookshop called Phlox. They wanted to plant phlox, so that was their planter. We've also introduced things like loading bays. You can see we've repurposed some old curbstones in this area over here to create a loading bay for each section of the street, widen the footway, and use a kind of Dutch clay pavers, and essentially narrowed the carriageway down to 4 meters with a ½ meter sort of drainage sort of ditch at each side. Introduce cycle parking, seating, and really sort of creating more space for businesses to spill out into the street. And it's been so successful. It's so amazed when I came back. This was about a year ago again, that just to see kind of how people were using the streets was really great. There were some kids learning to ride their bikes. People sat down even when there weren't seats. People sat on the floor just enjoying themselves, which was great to see. We also created some sort of smaller kind of almost like parklet or pocket park spaces, where we had sort of more planting and benches to really kind of reserve these spaces for people to sit and enjoy spending time in the streets, and to really kind of encourage businesses to think about how they might use their spaces outside their shops as well. And that's just a shot from the end of the street, so you can see the time closures and the one-way restrictions. And the sort of the scheme has been successful. This was an article. Basically, a lot of the new local businesses in the area that have taken over some of those vacant units or taken over from businesses that weren't very successful. A lot of the new businesses are owned and run by women living in the local area. And I know a lot of the business owners that I met lived around the corner, which is brilliant. So I think that was a really great sort of legacy for the project. And finally, it won the Healthy Street of the Year 2018, I believe, which is again a great sort of positive thing for the project as well. So just some final thoughts, really. I think there's lots of challenges and interesting things coming around sort of local high streets more recently. But I think how we accommodate things like more cargo bikes, more kind of bike share facilities, how we can sort of accommodate all that within some of these streets could be really important, and how we can really amplify how they're used. I think if your nearest sort of bike share hub is your local high street, and that's a great way to kind of drive more footfall to these places and create sort of that more sort of diverse range of uses. I think also one of the really great things Waltham Forest were doing was developing a zero emission delivery sort of project on the side, and this has been really successful as well and has grown quite a lot, and that's something that the businesses on Francis Road have been using as well, which is great, and how that can reduce deliveries and reduce freight on some of those local streets as well. Finally, not finally, but the sort of again how sort of local high streets are meeting other needs, providing sort of acting almost as freight hubs, so people can collect and post parcels to wherever else they're going. I think that's another great way that it becomes more of a hub for many more uses other than just popping to the high street or for a pint of milk. I think the more kind of different uses and reasons to visit we can build into some of these streets, the better. And finally, I thought an interesting sort of challenge for some of these local high streets might be things like EV electric vehicle charging, and actually how it's quite an interesting development in sort of streets, and obviously with COP26 and this sort of massive emphasis or over emphasis, I would argue, on EV, how that will relate to local high streets. Do we want people in the same way they would drive to a petrol station? Do we want people driving to local high streets for the purpose of charging their vehicle? I would argue no. I think it's interesting what provision should be provided in those kinds of spaces. And I think it's something that needs to be thought about really, really carefully over sort of the coming years, really. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Amy. That was really great, and a really, really beautiful street. I think a lot of people in the chat commenting on how wonderful it looks. And also really interesting to hear about that really intensive engagement and all that information that you've been sharing to try and kind of bring people along. Has anybody got any burning questions for Amy? Amy, do you want to, if you stop sharing, Amy, then I'll be able to.
What have I done?
I don't know. Claire, do you know how we can? You're unmuted. I can't hear you.
I'll see if I can stop sharing.
Oh wait, stop share. There we go.
There we go. No, thank you. Now I can see who's got hands up. So I'm just going to take, like, if anybody really has any sort of short questions, we'll take those. Bob, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to say that last slide showed EV chargers on the footway, which I don't think it's a good idea. That's all. Just
Claire.
Yeah, I'm not on mute. Yeah, my question, Amy, and thank you for walking through that so usefully. Yeah, my question's about, like, how would you quantify the amount and duration of engagement that you did with those businesses? So is it like one person for 6 months and 20 grand to spend on leaflets? Is it 2 grand, 2 people for a year? Is it one person for a week? Yeah.
Oh, that's a difficult one. I mean, I think one of the benefits is that I was embedded working for the council. So I think the first thing is that it was really easy to pop out and just say hello, visit people quite easily. Whereas had sort of a whole consultancy been involved, it might have been, you know, much more difficult to kind of get out there for those sort of quick and easy kind of conversations. I would say it wasn't sort of prohibitively, you know, it wasn't a huge amount of hours that went into it. I don't think there was an engagement team at Waltham Forest that consisted of kind of the engagement manager, the scheme designer, myself, and the project manager, and it was kind of divvied up between them. But you know, there were around 25 businesses, so not a huge number.
So were you mainly doing that yourself, Amy? You were doing that engagement, and then as part of the wider scheme? Yeah,
and I think, you know, both designing the scheme and engaging with businesses is a real was a real benefit. I think, you know, I think there's a lot of cynicism from businesses sometimes when I think when people at local authorities don't go out and speak to them directly. I think that causes a problem sometimes. I think they want to be spoken to by the people that they feel they should be able to speak to. You know, if they're within the local authority, why shouldn't I be able to speak to that person? And it's difficult, but I think it does help to show them that you're not kind of hiding behind a screen or anything, and you're out there. You want to talk to them, and I think that, you know, ultimately, I think that saves a lot of time further down the line in trying to kind of work through some really difficult issues and sort of work backwards from a negative reaction, really.
So the answer would be it was part of your time for a year or however long the scheme.
Yeah, I would say, you know, that no more than a few days really of going to the businesses and speaking to them. But yeah,
a few days across the whole project or a week?
I'd say probably a few days of total sort of lengths of conversation.
Interesting.
And then obviously there was kind of the pre-engagement, which I wasn't involved with, which was much more intensive. And then kind of the sort of feedback on the kind of burger van, as I was saying. That's all you'd add on to that as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Dave, I can see your hand up. Have you got a question for Amy?
Yeah, I've just stuck something also on the chat. For standards of setted pavements, the picture I put on the chat is a video of the self-flushing gully on a road that's been in for 160 years with virtually no maintenance and no potholes, because it's blockwork that's been laid in the old traditional style. I'm wondering what sort of standards you were using for laying sets and blockwork on the paved surfaces. Because quite often people do a cod version of this with very loose joints, and they brush dry mix into the joints, and then the stones rock and fall out.
Thanks, Dave. That's a good question.
It's quite a technical one. I'm afraid I can't really answer that because that would all be passed over to the technical design team. But it seems, you know, whenever I've been up, I don't know if they've had to replace any of the clay pavers yet, but it always seems in fairly good nick.
It's quite important. I don't know if Essex Mark is sort of lingering at all, but he and I are sort of pavement nerds, and it's on the A10 in London, for example, the manhole covers are surrounded by sets.
Yeah, I think
and that's the sort of detail that would be nice to work on.
I think it's a really good thing to raise. I think that, you know, we're all really interested in that.
You mentioned
longevity of things. I'm going to move on because we've got still got quite a few things to cover. Sorry, Dave. Claire, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question? I think that we'll probably keep that as the final one.
Just a quick one. Really interesting presentation. Really enjoyed it. We've got a similar street where I live, and we had a trial last summer for 4 months where the street was closed on Saturdays, which was great. But then the council reopened it to motorized traffic. And I guess I'm just after a little bit of advice about how do we kind of restart things when we had a trial. We had very little information shared by the council after the trial. Well, actually, we had nothing. They just decided to go back, and they said basically it was just temporary funding, which wasn't quite right. And just to say as well, I'm part of a local living streets group, and we've done a lot of engagement with businesses and local communities, but it's how do we get the council to try again or to do something about it?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one. You know, so many schemes are being, just so many good schemes are being ripped out, that it's such a shame around the country. I think it's really kind of going back to them and saying, asking them firstly what the reasons why, what evidence that decision was based on. There's a real risk with local authorities taking out infrastructure that they've received funding for, and how that will make it much less likely that they'll receive funding from from external sources like the government in the future. So I think there's a real question for them to answer around that and what their plans are around future street improvements, and how they intend to get funding for that if they've backed out of something. But also I think, just trying to galvanize local interest. You said you've done lots of engagement with people. I think, sort of lobbying, for want of a better word, trying to really kind of have those discussions and really put the arguments forward. A lot of councils have their own, have sustainable travel policies. Whether how well they're implemented when push comes to shove is another story. But I'm sure that there are statistics and aims and goals that they would like to achieve, and I think how you're trying to work with them on those goals, I think would be a really good way to do it. But the funding thing is a big one, because once you've ripped something out that you've got DFT funding for, it's a difficult one to come back from.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that, your presentation in itself is really useful, and it's something that I'm sure a number of us will be sharing with people. I think it's really good to sort of demystify that whole process of the development of a scheme, and how different places are doing these things differently. So it's definitely really great to see that. I think Claire is going to come in and give us a bit of a run through what was discussed, I think maybe 3 weeks ago now, is it, Claire, about school streets?
Yeah, so the idea with this was we were just sort of trying something a bit different, where 2 weeks ago we had a discussion about, it was broader than school streets. It was the discussion was kind of how do we enable kids to walk and cycle safely to school, really. And the aim of the discussion was, we have this session every week, Ideas with Beers, and a lot of how the space is used is, well, we get great talks like Amy's just given on kind of sharing something best practice, but we thought we'd try something different 2 weeks ago, where we had more of a discussion to try and like pool the collective knowledge on a subject where it kind of seemed like maybe that collective knowledge kind of didn't necessarily exist anywhere, and maybe we could play a role in pulling that together. So I've just put in the chat, because I haven't had time to do any fancy slides like Amy did, but I have written just a short document on kind of summarizing the key points from the chat, and I'll just sort of talk through them if that's okay. So as I said, the point of the discussion was to say, was to ask the question, like, what is best practice around enabling walking and cycling when it comes to children? And so it was a like open discussion, share what you know, share what you've been doing, and we had people contributing who were parents, teachers, council officers, bikeability training instructors. Right. And the key points for me that came out of it were, well, a couple of kind of key stats that I've put at the top, but we know that actually the school run is a big contributor to congestion, pollution, etc., etc. But it seemed like this instinct that actually there isn't necessarily anywhere where this problem is being tackled holistically in schools. It seems like that instinct is correct. So it seems like there are multiple examples of individual measures or individual initiatives, but they all only tackle a piece of the pie. And so it seems like the gap is for this kind of holistic approach aimed at the whole school community, including parents, teachers, and children. And so that was the first kind of key point that I took from the discussion. And I'm going to come back to this at the end, because I'm wondering if that could then be something this could work on, and do we try and find examples where that is the case? The second key point was that all the measures that people shared, most of them in some shape or form relied on volunteer time, whether that was teachers or parents. And that is, cannot be a viable policy to increasing walking and cycling in schools, because, as we know, teachers are massively busy, and also, parents, if you're relying on parents giving up their free time, that's going to exclude huge groups of society. And a related point is that the government, so far, all the funding, this was a really good point someone made, all the funding that's been released so far is focused on capital spending. All the money that's come out in the last year, the Emergency Active Travel Fund, now the Active Travel Fund, and other funding has been for schemes for infrastructure. And while they're needed, actually, when it comes to kind of helping schools work up their answer to this problem, then they need people, and that's funded by revenue funding, not capital funding. Related point was, it felt like this could be a key campaigning point for us all to take into the elections next year, apart from anything arguing against kind of safety for kids is really hard. If you're talking about bloody cyclists, that's going to get people's goat up. But actually, when it comes to children and the benefits for neighbourhoods, then that's hard to argue with. And I might actually just quickly share my screen at this point for a key thing, which I thought was a really great point somebody made. I didn't take any notes of anyone's names. Was that actually, a lot of people who are in this call are very focused on cycling, and if we were actually going to tackle this from a more right, where can we make the biggest impact, then potentially we'd be talking about walking. If you look at, I've put one example here of data from Manchester, where I live, on the travel to school rates, and you can see there the rates for walking are far, far higher, and rates for cycling are absolutely minuscule for under 16s. But for 18s and above, we start getting into cycling being a real viable option. So I thought that was really interesting, and potentially should our under 16s conversation be more focused on walking, and your 18s conversation be more focused on cycling. I'll stop sharing that screen now because it's a bit of a text heavy. So yeah, have a read of the document. Those are the sort of main takeaways for me, and like the variety of measures that were shared included school streets, and important to draw the distinction between one-off school streets where parents basically act as volunteers, and trials which include kind of permanent measures. And there was a very interesting point made that if we're talking about permanent measures, there's been quite a lot made of the fact that councils are going to be getting powers to introduce, take the income from enforcement measures from the end of the year, which means things like ANPR cameras or other enforcement measures perhaps would be more used outside of London. But it was a really good point made that basically, when it comes to school streets, cameras are a really, really expensive overhead, and you're only going to introduce ANPR cameras if you're therefore going to make an income from them. And that seems wrong when it comes to schools, where basically what you're saying is you're only going to make a revenue if your scheme's failing because people are breaking the rules. So perhaps bollards are actually a better option. They can be raised and lowered by school or by volunteers in a matter of minutes. So that was a really interesting point. So school streets need to become not this kind of ad hoc approach for individual schools, but what somebody dubbed was school streets as a service. Then we've got all these participation measures like walking and cycling buses, but again, point made how resource heavy they were. Then there's the kit and logistics, so whether that's cycle storage, cycle access, mapping routes to and from school. And then the fourth thing was these school travel plans, which again, a point was made that really school travel plans seem to be much more about like promoting walking and cycling, and it's to actually do them properly is a huge amount of work for which nobody is resourced to currently do. And then various other one-off initiatives. So yeah, I thought I'd just like do that summary and share that main takeaway, which is, so it seems like nowhere is anyone tackling the problem from the holistic point, and if they are, can you speak now and let's hear from an example of a school where that is being tackled holistically, because that seems like what we all need to be learning from. So I've got, shall I chair this bit, Sally? Because
yeah, I'm just going to say that to you. Why don't you take?
So so do you want to go first then? Or let's go to Mark, because we haven't heard from Mark yet.
Thanks. So I've been at the Brighton City Transport Partnership until 6 o'clock. We're talking about our LC whip and LTP, so that's why. But yes, you're right. I mean, in Brighton, we started off with 16 school streets, and then it went down to 11, and now it's only 4 because it's entirely parent-led. And now they're getting rid of bollards and going back to gates, which will affect it even more. And I think that, we haven't got the powers to use cameras. If and when they do come in. So I think your point, Claire, about looking at it holistically is right. I mean, I've written plenty of school travel plans, including, ironically, the one from the school that my son then went to later on, and got told off because it was too good, it was too professional, because normally it's done by parents and not by professionals. And I think the issue about the travel plans, and this is where you've got the thing with Bike It schools and Bike It Plus, is that it's things that the school can control. The travel plan should really be the stuff the school can control, and the school doesn't control the roads outside. So it doesn't want to start saying, put in a cycle crossing here, put in a pedestrian crossing there, because the school can't do anything about it. So it just looks like the school said do something and it doesn't happen. And then teachers obviously have plenty of other things to do. So until there's some sort of, and now with academies, of course, there's even less localization of schools, and there's even less links between schools and the local authority. So that connection is even more weak than it was. So there needs to be some form of almost, Department for School Travel that pulls all this together, which of course is a bit pie in the sky. So that's very negative.
Thanks, Mark. No, well, that's good. I was kind of testing out a theory, which so Sally, Simon, Ruth.
Yeah, I thought that was like a really interesting to kind of hear all of those different viewpoints, I think, and I think it's a really good thing to sort of point to campaign on. I wondered whether that whole idea though of cameras being, I suppose, being self-funding. I mean, do they have to be self-funding? I guess that's how they're funded, whether they are, that's how we pay for them and how we cover the cost of them. Well, it doesn't have to, it doesn't, so kind of just finish what I want to say. I just know that from the school, that one of the schools I've been talking to, that it would be not only logistically really difficult to put in barriers because it's on a corner, so you can't see around the corner, but also just the reluctance that there is for people to do this, even staff. So yeah, I mean, unless you can pay for somebody to come from the council and do that every day, but then they'd have to do it so I guess there's things like that. The only other thing I was going to say is I just wonder about walking. I've actually been looking at the statistics on this. The average length of journey for a primary school, I mean, I know this includes rural areas, but the average length is 1.5 miles, and I know, or 1.6 miles, and to secondary it's 3.4 miles. And certainly that's not just in rural areas. My kids' primary school has a huge catchment, like the whole city pretty much. So and probably most of the kids, having done a hands up survey across 90 children today, it seems like most of the children who live walking distance are already walking, the majority of them. So I just wonder whether it's cycling that we're missing, that like that bit of, you know, where it's just too far to walk to school with a 6-year-old, even half a mile, that's enough. You know, a mile is no. So I guess it's that, you know, thinking about what we're targeting. I think it's probably going to really depend on the school. And I'll finish.
Can I just quickly come back on some information on that, because we're actually doing a piece of work in actually, I probably shouldn't name where it is, a council that neighbours London but isn't a London authority, on access to schools on foot. And basically the reason is they want to stop giving kids free bus passes who live within the area. So I've been immersing myself in the Transport to School Act, or whatever it is, the National Education Act. So up to 8-year-old, it's 2 miles, and over 8, it's 3 miles. And the assumption is that until a child leaves secondary school, the parent will accompany them on a journey. So and it only looks at traffic safety. So if a journey takes a 15-year-old through a dark park at night, that is considered safe, and they are not entitled to a free bus pass for that journey. And the council can say it's safe, we don't have to put lighting in. They may want to put lighting in for other reasons, but from the point of view of the Education Act, they're not obliged to. And the expectation is the parent will walk with them to school until they're 16. That is the law, and the law is way, way, way out of date.
Interesting. Thanks, Mark. Simon and then Ruth.
Yeah, I was just going to say, my experience of school streets, school travel plans, school, all these kind of things, is that simple truth is that if the senior leadership team isn't heavily bought into this stuff, you're on a hiding to absolute nothing. And I say this as a parent who saw a kid get knocked down very heavily on a zebra crossing right outside the school my kids went to with my kids. And at that point, you know, was standing right next to the head teacher and said, you know, come on, this is ludicrous. And there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. And I'm like, of course there's things you can do. So, you know, I'm very glad to say that school now has school streets, but it took a change of head to get to that point. And that's the simple reality here, is this kind of top-down idea. Unless someone can get the government to mandate these kind of things at a very high level, with budget to back it and resources, all councils can, then you're hiding to nothing unless you go in at the school level. And that's the real key to me, is like, you know, Living Streets have done loads of good work in this. Sustrans have done some really good work in this in terms of walking to school, cycling to school. But it has to come down to the school level, I think, really, to get some traction on this issue.
Yeah, well, yeah, your point being that unless there's a kind of policy-wide approach, it's down to individuals, which is what we need to avoid.
But also that I don't see a policy, I'm going to be very frank, and I don't see a policy-wide approach arriving anytime soon, sadly. So meanwhile, I would say it's down to parents to deal with their schools and push for better. And it's, you know, it's really noticeable, the schools that have cycling buses, that have amazing active travel plans, that have all these kind of things, are the schools where the senior leadership team have no parking and are turning up on bikes or on foot. You know, that's the predictor of what's going to be a good fertile school for doing more stuff.
Yeah. All right. Cheers, Simon. Ruth.
Hi, yeah, well, I brought this up a couple of weeks ago. Pre-2010, every school had to have an active travel plan, which all schools had to sign up to. I worked on 2 of them for 2 of our schools, primary and secondary. And one of the problems was the funding. Was, yes, the school came up with this excellent plan, but it included having 2 zebra crossings. And as we know, zebra crossings with Felicia beacons cost a lot of money, and therefore we didn't get them. So it was the lack of funding, even though it was an excellent plan. Both schools, Belmont Primary School and Chiswick Secondary School, are in traffic islands. What's happened now, though, with the new schemes that are going on in Chiswick, is both the heads of both those schools, because I've worked with them, have got on to supporting the quieter neighbourhoods schemes and have had a big say in agreeing that, for example, Fisher's Lane, which may or may not have crossed anyone's radar, is remaining closed partly because the primary school head teacher wrote a very strong letter to say it's made it much, much safer to get to the school for her children. I would say, obviously, I'm London, but secondary school children generally don't get driven that much. It is primary who are driven. I think we need to get rid of school choice, because that actually effed us all up big time, because before that, children did go to their local school that they could walk or cycle to. I also, in terms of cycling over walking, I agree with Sally that, you know, for some of them, the distances are too big to walk, but they could cycle. And I think cycle schemes need to be run at weekends for cycle training so more parents can buy into it. And again, a big shout out for Hounslow Council, because they very successfully bid for yet another 3 years of funding for cycle training and try before you buy bike schemes. However, again, this is year on year, they're having to bid for schemes, and what government needs to do and what we all need to push for is that there is mandatory funding every single year, which is for active travel, not this piecemeal, you know, this council get it, that won't, because they don't bid properly. And that's what's failing us. And please don't forget my last word. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. And so that was lots of good points there, but particularly like the first one about how the heads at those two schools are basically, so the active neighbourhood kind of encompassing the school and vice versa. Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
Asked them, I approached them and asked them, would they get involved in campaigning for both the schemes, and gladly they did, and their letters did hold quite good sway. So, and actually I'm going to go and speak at Chiswick School in a couple of weeks about not just cycling, but about the environmental issues and getting the young kids engaged and the students engaged on that.
Yeah, thank you. Martin, I think you had your hand up and then it's gone down again, and then I'll go to Megan and then Graham.
Just really brief. I mean, Ruth mostly said what I was going to say in a sort of throwaway form of you know, do away with parental choice, but actually just this whole aspect of we kind of want to have everything, and so we want to be able to choose where our kids go to school, even if that's, you know, a huge distance away that we have to drive them. We want to be able to fit it in with getting to work, and we end up with this sort of almost entitlement culture of well, I have to be able to do this thing, drive to the school gates because of all those things we set up. So I think there are broader societal issues that we've put in place, and I think if we don't look at those, we miss part of the picture as well.
Thank you. Did I say Graham and then Megan?
I just want to come back to you mentioned taking a holistic view, and I'm always a bit nervous about saying, should we be looking at cycling or should we be looking at walking, etc. I think it's important in that to distinguish between the inputs or the enablers and the outputs or the benefits and beneficiaries. Certainly, as far as school children, them having a way to get to school without going in the car as a beneficiary, as a benefit, is a good thing to use, because it's something that people can't argue with. But the thing that enables that, of course, is healthy neighbourhoods with low levels of motor traffic. And the fact is that the only way to reduce motor traffic is through three things: walking, cycling, and public transport. And so we need to make sure that we don't throw out any one of those components when we're sort of thinking about, should we be talking about cycling or walking or public transport. It's really all of those. But certainly, as far as beneficiaries and a way to sell this, walking to school, yes, is a useful thing. But without those enablers, it won't work.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, I think my point, wasn't about excluding or picking one. It was more just reminding us all, given that I think a lot of people here are more on the cycling side, that that there's another part of the equation, and as you've said, public transport is in there too. Megan.
Yeah, I've heard a rumor after this talking to Beth from this chat a couple of weeks back, that DFT might actually be thinking about trying to get the school travel census back in, which would be wonderful, because then we'd actually all know what percentage of our kids are generally walking or cycling or driving or whatever, which would be really fantastic. But you know, in terms of helping to build that kit, I know it's asking volunteers to do something else, but just getting that evidence base and getting a sense of how people are traveling. So if you can encourage the school or help set up a hands up survey, or, you know, there's another mechanism that you can do in order to try to get a sense of how far people are traveling and how they're traveling. I think just having that evidence base can then help you to advocate more widely.
Yeah, and the there's a number of tools that are available that you can use to help schools do that, aren't there? Great. Okay. Does anyone else want to come in? Otherwise, I've got a question for the group on what we do next. Is that an old hand up, Graham, or a new hand?
Sorry, that's an old one. I didn't
That's
cancel
an old
it.
one. Okay. I can't see any other hands. So yeah, question then is, you know, what we've just heard from Amy is a brilliant case study of a street that's been transformed to enable people to spend more time, spend more money, spend less carbon emissions. Do we have such an example of a school where perhaps, as Reeves pointed out, it's been part of an active neighbourhood scheme where this has been tackled holistically, that we could hear from? Does anyone know of such a place? Mark?
Well, there was always this idea that Kesgrave School in Ipswich did really well. At least when I was at Sustrans, it was always floated as an example of a school that won all the intercollegiate competitions because the kids were always so healthy because they all walked and cycled. Now that was maybe 10, 15 years ago. Maybe it's not so good anymore, but it was in a new town area on the outskirts of Ipswich, and things were built holistically in. And I think there's a school in Oxford that's similar. Is it Headington? Might be. So there are two examples, but they may well be way out of date. Have we got anyone? I don't know if we have anyone. Wilf Bramhill is from Colchester, not far away, so maybe he knows Ipswich, but I don't think we've got anyone from Ipswich.
I think it's Martlesham School, not Kesgrave.
Yes,
of the two.
Yeah. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Well, yes, you're there.
Yeah.
We've always got Sean in Ipswich, McDonald, isn't it? Sean McDonald. He's based at Ipswich Cycle Campaign.
Yes, he's definitely Ipswich. So yeah, so we
Okay,
might be, I mean, as I said,
sorry,
maybe out of date.
Yeah, so we've got Martlesham and Eddington, which may be out of date. Brian's got his hand up. Brian? Oh, it's
Hello,
Brian.
everyone.
It's Brian. It's that Brian.
It's that Brian. Yeah, I've been listening. Yeah, I was going to say Eddington as well. I didn't hear Mark say, but yeah, I had a look at that school and it was a huge amount of like parents dropping off by cargo bike and stuff, and it was all built in as part of the town. So yeah, I've got lots of photos on that, but that'd be a really good one to do. I think they're doing some great stuff in Cambridge.
So Brian,
The one that I know about, somebody mentioned Cardiff earlier, is the school in Cardiff where Tristan Davis, I think his name was, who's now chair of Active Travel Wales or something, was one of the governors, and they created, they called it the car-free school. It's not completely car-free, but has anyone heard of that one? Might be good to hear about that school on a future Ideas with Beers, especially if no one's heard of it.
I might just put in, Claire, for the IRA in Inverness, because
is that a school in Inverness?
Yeah, the Inverness Royal Academy.
Okay.
Back in the 80s, when I was in Inverness, used to get 600 kids all piling out of school when it closed off, and literally they flooded the road. It was on foot, on bike, and Inverness is high levels of cycling because of the nature of the city. But that school, when it turned out in the 80s, was like masses of kids all over the road.
Anything up more recent than the 80s, Dave?
Well, I don't know if I suspect it's still carrying on the same, but I've not been in Inverness enough. I've got a few contacts I could try out there and see whether it's doing the same. But they've been quite big on that.
Cool. Okay. Well, unless anyone's got anything else to add, I'm going to take that as an action that we'll try and get someone on from Headington, Cardiff.
Yeah, can I just be clear? There's Eddington and Headington. Eddington without an H is a new school and a new area in Cambridge, and Headington, HEAD, is an area in Oxford. And I think
Right.
I think we're getting confused about the two. So I
Which
think they're both
one
worth.
do you think is the one we
Well, I
should
think
go-
they're both probably the Oxford people would know about
Okay.
Headington. I'm trying to
Anyone here from Oxford can follow up with Headington.
I think we need to wrap up soon. It's getting late.
Sure, we had someone here from Oxford. Thanks for that, Ruth. And anyone here who could follow up with Cambridge and Eddington?
Yeah, I might be able to do that.
Was that you, Robin?
It was me, Robin, yes.
Okay. Thanks, Robin.
Yeah.
And I can follow up with Cardiff. Great. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, we'll finish up here. And before we do, let's hear from Ruth.
Thank you. Sorry, it's just I've had a long day. I need to go. Police. I don't know if this is one that Robert can help me out with. So I had a street meeting with two of my local bobbies the other day. It was very useful because people were hurtling down my street at well over 20 miles an hour, so they could see it in action. Unfortunately, during the day, a young woman had been knocked off her bike by a driver at part of a junction with the new cycle route. And I asked them if they could give me information because I knew it was the driver error that they turned into the road and the girl was cycling west to east as she should be allowed to do. And one of the police cycled himself and he said, oh yeah, it's really difficult. I'll try and find out for you. The other one went, yeah, I know, but, and I said, I know what's coming. He said, well, I don't cycle, but. And his view was we need to all share the road nicely and we all got to take care and it's all got to be marvellous. We really need we've got lorry drivers who have to have cycle training. We really need every single policeman to have had to be on a bike so that they know exactly what it is that we deal with and what we have to put up with day after day after day. And that is the last word.